Welcome back to our second part of this mini-series. We are, across all 3 episodes, we're looking at decision making under pressure, and then today we're going to look specifically at a framework kind of to help empower people to, so they can reflect on different parts of decision making and ultimately, get better and develop the skill set. Welcome back again to Ben.
Thank you very much.
And to Jazz.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to sort of digging into this because, again, as we talked about last time, I think we've all got different natural tendencies. And I know you won't want to, Stephen, but feel free to just shout out from the back.
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about something that we've developed sort of as part of our leadership program, and it's called a soda loop. And it might sound a little bit jargony, but that's an acronym, again, to kind of help people in the decision-making process. So to give that a little bit of context, it's based on something called an OODA loop, which I think if you said that to teachers too many times, they'd giggle quite a lot. So that was one of the reasons to sort of move it to a different acronym. But that was developed by sort of the real Top Gun, where they fighter pilots in America, and they developed a system to help them make decisions under pressure while they're training sort of in dogfights, in sort of combat in air-to-air, where it's very, very high pressure and very, very high stakes. And what they found with these OODA loops, which are to observe, orientate, decide, act, which was whoever completed the most amount of those loops, so would go through that, where am I, where do I want to be, what do I have to do to get there, what are my options, decide, execute. Now I'm in a new place, where do I want to be, what's my new, what are the new things I could do, what's my new decision, what's my new action, where am I now, where do I want to be. Whoever completed the most loops won those dogfights, won those training sessions, and my understanding is every single time. So that came down to, it's not who makes the better decisions, it's who makes a better string of decisions, and that's why it's called a loop. So again, I don't think you can say OODA loop to teachers. That was an instinct of mine. It was a decision that I made under the pressure of that, and I think it was a good one.
Sounds like a dance.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's do the OODA loop.
Yeah.
That'll go down well.
Yeah. And at the end of the podcast, because we are filming Ben will show an OODA loop. Out. Yeah, he'll do an improv version of that. But the soda loop itself is a framework to help you make better decisions. And we're going to go through it really kind of methodically. Life doesn't go like that, but what I would say with all of these things is, if you're not going to use the soda loop, if you think that feels really clunky or that doesn't work for you, what are you going to do instead? You have to do something to help you make, and especially help your team make decisions under pressure. So if you're not going to use this, and there are lots of different decision making frameworks out there, choose something else. So that's what I would say on that. So the soda loop itself is that you start with S, which is the situation, and the situation is, in these terms, where you are and where you want to be. So the first thing you need to do with making a decision is establishing the situation. Where am I, but where do I want to be? And then the next part in terms of the soda loop, so once you've established the situation, is your options. The nuance to that is, it's not just the possibilities of your way forward, it's also the things that you want to avoid. That's also the thing to consider in that sort of phase. Then the decision itself. And the decision itself, again, you want to, what is the best decision you can make with the information you have to move you closer from where you are to where you want to be? And that's your decision. And usually it's a combination of 2 or 3 of those options that you've established. Yeah. And then finally is the action that you take and the execution. And that's quite important. And I think it's worth coming back to that and spending a little bit of time on that. It's more important spending time on the options and the avoidance. Really, that's your key part of this loop. But it's worth looking at all of these in detail.
Yeah. I like the opportunity it gives for critical thinking as well during that, having that process, and we're talking about pressure, and to alleviate pressure, not just as a means in itself, but to enable better decision making. And so for me, having a process already instills an element of calmness. And in a team environment, everyone's on board, and we know that, okay, we need to make a decision, this is what we go through, rather than it being like we talked about in the previous podcast, some mysterious thing, someone stands there, says, give me a moment, looks out the window, and boom, there's a decision appears. That's not what happens. And the other thing which I think is really important about this process is that loop nature. I think is really clever, which is a great antidote to decisions just being an isolated event, possibly just to remove the pressure. So I'm under pressure, I just need to make a decision, it removes that pressure, done, I forget about it, move on. Whereas that's not real, and that's not helpful. And in a school situation where we're making decisions which will impact on other people, likely, that's I would have thought the likelihood, isn't it, with children and with staff, etc., and the community, is that to have a loop process, I think is great, because you allow yourself to come back to return to it, which then takes pressure off, because you're going to get a chance to refine it. I think it's so many layers to it.
But do you think the soda loop works better, like you said, when you've got a group and you've got a team of people? Because I found that far more effective, and you can see, okay, there's a plan, we're going through it, everyone's around the table. But then and there are times when you have to make that decision.
Yes.
Then what is the difference when we're going through a soda loop from a group of people to just you in isolation?
Yeah.
I feel like they're both very different processes, aren't they? Yes, it's the same process, but how you look at it is completely different.
Yeah, certainly how you navigate it.
Yeah.
And again, it all seamlessly works together, like it's a sequence, like it's been really well thought through. But what we'll come to, one of the things is what you're talking about there is team dynamics then play a massive part in how you go through that process together. And of course, if you've got a good team, the decision is going to be far, or not necessarily a good team, if you've got good team dynamics, your decision is going to be far, far more balanced than one person. It's almost undeniable. If you've got bad team dynamics, making that decision, going through that loop is going to be so hard to even go through one, because so that's a really key, so keep on listening if you want to hear that one, because the team dynamics podcast is coming, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll go into more sort of depth in that. But that first step, that kind of situation, and I wonder, in terms of your experience as well, one of the things that I've found is that sometimes at the beginning of your career, or I don't know, maybe that's not fair to say actually, because I think some people have a really good natural tendency of this, but a situation could be quite literal, where it might be, so let's just say like quite a low pressure situation. We've got a sports club that, not the one that's taking part next door to the podcast, but we've got a sports club, children really love it, parents love it, there's 20 children booked on, and the person that delivers it phones in sick. So now you've got to make a decision there. So the literal thing is, here's the situation, here's where I am, there's no one to take this club, I need someone to take this club. That's a very literal kind of situation. I don't know if you do. But then you can step back from that and say, actually, where I am is, there's no one to take the club and what I want is the children to have a really great, meaningful after-school experience, which builds on the provision that they have. Now, those are two different situations, and therefore everything that follows in terms of options and things to avoid will sort of come from that. Yeah. But that's the sort of, that would be my advice to people sort of looking at this loop, is just stop. And I think maybe one of the pushback, and I suppose again I'm a sort of I'm a naturally high urgent sort of type of person. I might look at, when I first heard about this, I thought, well, how on earth did they go through, you don't have time, you have to just make a decision. But actually, and I think, we've done this in practice now, sort of in the field. Yeah. You've always got time. Sometimes you've got 30 minutes, sometimes you've got 30 seconds, but simply stopping and using all of that time to inform that decision always helps. And even in the most pressing situations and the most challenging situations, I've found that you've always got more than 30 seconds. Yeah. You've always got, you've always got a couple of minutes, even in the most pressing situations, and usually you actually have a lot longer than that. Yeah.
And that's part of the situation, isn't it? So the key questions to begin with is, what's the time frame on making this decision?
And And that also impacts the rest of how your soda loop
it does, doesn't it?
Then follows through based on that right at the beginning, right, how much time have I got to go through this and make the decision.
Which then leads to what you said about other people involved.
Yeah.
And so in real practical terms, you could say, okay, let's get these people together within the next 2 weeks to discuss, to make this decision. Or I've certainly been in a position, and I'm on the phone, someone's phoned me, I need to speak to you, can you ring me, it's urgent, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so I have to make a decision, and I'm interacting just with one person. But that's established because I've got 30 minutes to make a decision, or I need to make a decision within this phone call because we need to act within 30 minutes because of some pressing reason, that things like that, which are outside of our control. So it could be because it's going to have some impact on the school day, and children always come first in the school, in the safety of children and things like that. So that type of a decision you have to make. And so you don't have time to bring all the people around the table, do you?
No.
So you have to still try and stick to the process, even if you're having to not necessarily compromise, but you're having to think, well, I'm going to have to contribute to this bit, or I'm going to have to ask you to contribute to this bit, even though I know it's not your natural, but we know the process.
Yeah.
So we are going to think about the situation, even if naturally Alan's, I just want to make a decision. It's like, yes, but we're going to do this, aren't we? And I think
even if you've got less time than 30 minutes and you have to quickly make that decision, having that process is really important. And then it eliminates, as we said in the previous podcast, that pressure. As soon as I found from experience, as soon as you deviate from this process, that's when more situations arise, that's when the pressure increases because you didn't stop and take that time to go through it. But I think that also comes with experience. The more experience you have going through these situations, the more you realise actually it's so important to stick to the process.
And that's what I like about the what do you want to avoid as well.
Yeah,
when it comes to, I think that to me really struck home because when thinking of options, you're often thinking about what you want the outcome to look like, and so how could we get to that outcome, and there might be some choices. But I really do like that, what do you want to avoid, because I think that's really informative for the decision you're making, particularly if it's something where the impact of a decision is broader. And it could be something as, say, simple. I've been in the situation as a head where suddenly there was no water in the school. Establish the situation. What information do we have, and once you establish that there isn't going to be any water in the school, so there's one flush left per toilet, there's no way we can do meals, so you have to think, well, we're going to have to close the school then. So the impact of that is on what do we want to avoid? We want to avoid chaos, we want to avoid children just wandering off with all those obvious things, and that decision has to be made quickly depending on the time of the day, and for me it was really close to lunchtime, so I had to make a decision very quickly. But you do have enough seconds to go through the process.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in, but that changes it. You've very skillfully moved us on to the options there, which is extremely helpful. But that is the situation as well. Getting this information at 9 and getting this information at 3 changes that situation.
Absolutely,
where you are and where you want to be. Like they're very similar, but the situation itself is time plays a factor in that. People, all of that. So that's the first thing to establish. And one of the things to just quickly jump back is we talked a little bit about the neuroscience. My understanding is the chimp system doesn't do processes. Like it doesn't do sort of those compliance. It goes on a more instinctive, like what's in front of me, and more. It's more reactive. By forcing yourself into a process, and I think this is why I think astronauts have to do sort of an hour and a half of checks and things like that before, and it's part of a safety mechanism of getting them into that computer state of mind of following a process to lower that limbic system, to sort of flush that out of the system. So again, that what we've experienced is that having a process helps reduce the pressure. But actually that's the science behind why that happens. So I would advise personally, when you move into the options phase, the first thing for me is, what do I want to avoid? When I started this, and when I created this, the process was, what are the options? Now look at what you want to avoid. But experience has taught me, start with what you want to avoid. And not just big things, silly little things as well, and then move on to the options. Because
I agree.
Because then all of those options, you're naturally kind of going against. Well, that does that, but it causes that thing that I want to avoid. It stops that one. It causes more of that one. So if we just really quickly, like this situation with the after school club, the things we want to avoid the children missing out. We want to avoid upsetting the parents that rely on us. We want to avoid damaging the relationship with the external provider, especially if there's a perfectly reasonable reason this has happened. We want to avoid putting on to, because one of the things that will happen here is that teacher that just says yes to everything will be like, I'll do that, and then they'll spend that, what they were going to do for that hour will now go into their time that they should be with their family, and they've already said yes to 100 other things, so that's another thing I want to avoid. So, and then I start to go from there to go, so what are our options? And my, again, sort of advice from someone who's gone through this process, a lot of times, when you're working with a team, sometimes it's helpful to kind of throw out options that are stupid. To kind of put it on the table of, we're definitely not doing this then. To put out, so what we could do, just cancel it and tell the parents, sorry, your problem.
Not our fault.
Not our fault. But and everyone will laugh at that. But actually, the reason that you do that is to kind of go, so we're not doing that. And everyone laughing is that agreement of, okay then, because obvious. My chimp is kind of saying, well, it's there. I have to go and pick up my kids sometimes. But actually, we all agree. There's a consensus here, and you don't have to. So I wouldn't say don't labour a lot of decisions you wouldn't go with, but I'd say it is a helpful part of the process just to chuck out those. This is an option. We could do this, but we're not going to. So then that's that next phase, and then you move on. I don't know, is there anything that Ben, I think it's really interesting because you've mentioned that when we've delivered this training face to face, that what do we want to avoid is something that you found very helpful in this process. But again, if we go back to those kind of the insights colours or the Clifton strength side of thing, that's because your strengths lean towards possibilities.
Yes.
Don't they?
They do, yeah.
So for you, it might be, whereas for someone maybe who had that sort of high blue to green, I think the avoidances might come to them much more naturally, and they might look at, but we've got all of these things that we need to try and avoid, therefore this decision is almost impossible.
Yes.
And they wouldn't naturally move on to those possibilities, whereas you start with the possibilities. And
but I think why I found it really useful is because I do believe it helped, as you said, with the selection of those options. Because the danger I have to be mindful of is I can continue to think of options. I can continue to think of positive reasons why we could do that, and then must really annoy people. I can then layer those. I can go to sub-options from that, like a tree that keeps growing and growing, and sometimes I see the despair in people's eyes as I'm having a whale of a time. If I've got a large whiteboard in front of me, I can fill it, no problem. However, that you then paralyse the sort of decision making because you've just flooded the situation with almost infinite possibilities, and then I'm really confused now. I don't know what to do. So that's why I really like that. What do you want to avoid? Because I think that gives a better framework that's useful to the situation. So going back to the example you gave with the after school club, we want to avoid reputational damage. We want to avoid upsetting the parents because of those things. We want to avoid an unintended consequence by asking someone so-and-so who we know we can always go to step in, but then they neglect to do a task that's we don't know yet, but it's going to impact us tomorrow, so now we could have avoided that. So I like that because it allows for options, but not too many.
Yeah, and often the avoidance, I find, what you want to avoid quickly informs your solutions.
It does
as well.
Yeah.
So it's adding a further systematic layer to the process by going through it that way. That's really helped me. definitely.
You're right. It does help.
Yeah, and I think what it does is, for me, what it's helped do is it's helped say, right, this possibility, but if I just do it like this, because I'm trying to avoid that. Whereas, getting those things established, and for me, I think naturally something like a process is stifling to those more creatively minded, but for me, you actually have greater scope for creativity because you're establishing things. You're establishing, want to avoid this, and now there's a world of possibilities. And I think, again, to go back to the sequence and how brilliantly thought out this is. I'm happy with this being filmed so people can see that I'm smiling there and I'm not. I don't. It's
genuine.
I genuinely think this is brilliantly thought out. I'm saying that with a pinch of salt. That the other key thing here is that when you have your vision sorted, when you know your values, that informs all of this as well. Yeah. And so, for example, let's just really try and simplify this as much as possible. So to simplify, the school we're talking about, their vision is to give the children an experience so memorable that it sets them up for pursuing a life that's meaningful to them. That's it. It's as simple as that. So what decision here? We could do it this. So now our options are. But one of the things we want to do, one of the things we want to get to is this is a little moment. But what we're here to do is make this a memorable moment. So one of the things we could do is stick them in front of a film, and they could just watch a film. We just hold them there for that. Or we could, but that won't take us closer to that.
It's a test, isn't it? You're testing that bigger picture.
But having the clarity on that bigger picture just helps. And then also when you go and make a decision, and Jazz goes and makes a decision, and I go and make a decision, when we have that really clear vision and the clear values about the things we're going to avoid, because that's what values are, aren't they? Yeah. It's going to be the more typical options we pursue, the more typical things we try to avoid. And the vision is what all of those situations are trying to take us towards. When we have real clarity on those things, everyone making those different decisions drives you ideally. And we're talking about pressure. It's messy. None of this makes things easy. I hope that is coming across, that it's every single one of these processes is messy. But then to move on to that next point to say because Ben, like you've talked about that tree of possibilities, and but here's some more, and everyone's like, okay, then we've managed to get them to agree to something. You're like, yeah, you have, and right, so we're going to execute this, and it's going to have. You're right, it could be this as well. You're like, no, Ben, please.
Why don't we do this? Yes.
But it's like stepping up to take a penalty in a penalty shootout. There are all number of ways that you could get to that. You can just score, and all of them could be a great idea.
That's right. Yeah.
Ultimately, make a decision, execute it.
Yeah.
Now the game continues.
Yeah.
And you might look and go, I wish I'd done kicked it in that corner. I wish I'd done this. Yeah. Even if you scored, but you've done it. You've achieved an outcome, and here we are. We're into another situation. Because so that's why I'd say with the decision, my advice would be to those sort of stepping into these experiences for the first time is look at combining, almost like when we do it, we sort of draw it out, don't we? Of like, here's where we are, an island here, here's where we want to be, which is an island over here. There's these spikes underneath of the things we want to avoid, and almost like a rainbow.
How did we get there? How do we get there across the rainbow?
Yeah, we build
nicely.
That. So here's the strands of that rainbow, which are all of our different options, and it's almost like you plait those options together to make that decision, which is your decision on how, based on your best opinion on what's going to move you from here to there. I don't know if you talk to that kind of that, right, make that decision, like based on those. I don't know if there's anything you'd add to that.
I like what you said about the linking it back then to what we're about, that bigger picture.
Yeah.
And I know you can't do that in every single decision. If the fire bell goes, you don't go, hey, what's our options?
Yeah.
And what are our values? And you just do it. And that goes down to, again, within lots of organisations, but in an educational context, we have statutory controls. There are legal elements which actually make some of our decisions easy anyway. So that, again, just dropping back into the situation, you establish those sorts of things. But when it comes to then making that decision, I mean, that's so empowering to know that you've gone through a process.
Yeah.
You've increased the opportunity for that to be a good decision, if we if we're going to use that terminology, based upon the information you have. And I think that itself alleviates the pressure again. As I mentioned earlier, those sorts of layers of things you can benefit from by having a process. And for me, who could get stuck in those options thing, having a process chivies me along and helps me lead, and which is great. And I know that there's some decisions I can be more creative in, other ones just need to get on with, you know.
And for the self-reflection part of it as well, at the end, you know, if you stick it, you know, again, like we've said, not in every situation you'll stop and think about your visions, values, but looking at that bigger picture, whichever decision you made, if you reflect back at the end, right, okay, yes, it could have gone better, it could have gone a different way, but did I stick to the values? Yes.
Yeah.
I think that will give you that peace of mind of, it could have gone a different way, but it still went well. And that, again, going back, that alleviates that pressure of you were true to your values, you were true to your vision, and it was successful.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the final part, which I think, you know, it's not necessarily, I think, the easiest thing to convey in this kind of format, sort of, you know, talking on a podcast. But then there's also the action itself, and then there's executing the decision that you've made. And I think that this is another, you know, I'm very happy to say this is a fault, like, this is an issue that what I'm about to say is the mistake that I've made, which is you execute the plan, you carry out the action, you do the thing that you said you were going to do. There are consequences. You don't move far enough from that island to that island, and you say, oh, okay, so the decision was wrong. But a lot of times, the execution of the plan is what actually hasn't gone well.
Yes.
And the decision was absolutely fine. The decision. Yeah. So then what happens is, what goes into your next kind of, I'm not going to make that decision again. Whereas actually, it was a great decision.
Yeah.
Like, it was, or, you know, whatever, you know, the decision was sound, but that execution. And Jazz, I know you want to talk more cricket in these podcasts, so to bring up one of the things that I know that you've mentioned off camera a lot is that there was a moment in, like, you know, an England cricket match where a player got caught out playing a risky shot, but when they talked about it afterwards with the sort of leadership team on camera, they said, you know, that's one of his best shots.
Yeah.
And he scores. We needed a lot of runs. He scores a lot of runs. So although it was risky, he didn't watch the ball for long enough, and his foot was in the wrong position. Yeah. So actually, it wasn't his decision. His decision was good to go to a strong shot and play it, even though it was a risk. It was, he put his foot in the wrong place and he looked away from the ball at the last minute. And I think that's a really key point. I'm glad you raised that, Jazz.
Yeah, we've always got to bring sport into it. And I think it's those elements that you can't control, isn't it? And I think sport's a great place to sort of use those metaphors. And I was thinking of the rugby. It's incredible how long ago it is now. When the England men's rugby team won the World Cup in 2003. And apparently prior to that, they'd had a game where they got to a situation which they did win, and it was against Wales. And anyone that knows anything about rugby, and particularly Wales fans, would hate this or listen to a player talking about it, that because of that game, which England won just about, they really looked deeply into what are we going to do if we're in this type of situation, which was we're getting towards the last minute of the game and things like this. So what had happened in that Welsh game was they said that was lucky, that was, but we scraped through. So for Welsh fans would hate the fact that experience led to England winning the World Cup, but it meant that when they
you're really labouring, you're hammering that point out. You want that?
Just want it to be clear. But so when they were in that situation, the final, they knew that in a given situation they were going to take a drop goal to score 3 points to win, and it was like Hollywood stuff. It's the last minute. They've even made a film about it and all that sort of thing. And it was Hollywood, but it was a process that they'd agreed and practiced. If this thing happens, what are our options? What are we going to do? Yeah. How are we going to act? What decisions are we going to make? And they played through that, and there were sort of 4 or 5 steps they went through, and they were able to execute it. Now, it could have been on another day that the same thing happened, but the ball went off to the left and it went. But I think they would have still said, but we went through a process, we went through a plan, it was the execution of it. And I think back to a school thing, there are many elements we can't control. But if we've executed and we know we've gone through right people around the table, as you said earlier on, then that's the best we can do. We learn from it, and then when we're in a similar situation again, we've got something to reflect on and refer to, haven't we?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, 100%. So I guess we've kind of gone into the loop itself then, and as we talked, the key is really you make a decision, you act, you carry it out, and then bang, you're in a new situation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you go back into the loop. Where am I? Where do I want to be? What do I want to avoid? What are my options? What am I going with? And then you keep going. I think, I don't want to say this from a sort of legal point, but like I do really, my experience is 99 times out of 100, no decision is the worst decision. You know, just like spending delaying and trying to find that perfect solution where there are absolutely no negative consequences or everybody's happy with it. That's the worst decision you can make. Ultimately, the best decision is to make a decision, carry it out to the best of your ability, in line with your values, in line with the school's whole purpose or your organisation's whole purpose, then on to the next one, then on to the next one. Because realistically, moving from A to B, I mean, a minimum of 3 loops, you know, a minimum of 3 decisions, like for something significant. So delaying and trying to nail it sort of in one, it's so unlikely, it's so impossible.
Yeah. I was just thinking, actually, I'm trying to think if I've ever been in a situation where the decision was to not make a decision, and I don't think that's been possible, because most of the things you have to act, and therefore you can't just say, I'm not going to make a decision on that, because someone would look at it and go, what?
And making that decision and then going through the process again, accepting that,
absolutely.
Okay, I've made the decision, it may have not been the best decision, but actually with the time that I had and the resources that I had or anything else I had, it was the best decision at that time. But then we go through the process again and again and again.
And I suppose to give this a dose of reality, I know that one of the things you're interested in here, Jazz, is sort of no team has like a really natural kind of balance of natural traits, and so we'll sort of, if we come to that in a second, but I think to sort of give everyone the cold hard reality of, especially if you're in very senior leadership, you are responsible for those decisions, and nobody at this table is saying, look, you do this and it'll be fine. Like there will be consequences. Like hopefully the better decisions you make, those consequences will be ones that, you know, are positive. But ultimately you make decisions, you act it out, you know, that's why you're in that position to take that level of responsibility. But you won't be able to just say, well, I think that there's this natural chimp thing of, if I don't make a decision, I won't get in trouble, because it's the decision that gets me in trouble. But that's not the truth. Like the truth is, you're making a decision to not make a decision, and so that's also
that's right.
And it feels safer. And actually, like, you know, and you know, one of the things I have heard is that that's why people say no to so many things, because you don't get in as much trouble for saying no to something as you get in trouble for saying yes to something that doesn't pay off. I've heard like film executives talk about that, of something like they had Edward Norton and this person, they still said no. Because they were just like, it's easier, it's safer to say no, like in the long run. But I guess there is this reality to it that, you know, we are going to be responsible for those decisions, and this isn't a way of saying, so everything will be fine if you think about things like this. It just is raising the probability of you making better decisions, so those ones that you are responsible for do lead to more positive kind of outcomes.
It's a positive, doing your utmost to increase the chance of positive consequences rather than the negative consequences, unintended consequences you're unaware of. Which is why I think, you know, Jazz mentioned earlier and in the previous podcast, that importance of clarity and communication. You know, they run through this, don't they, within that whole decision making process, and part of the thing that you do, because that allows, as best you can, to get all that information on, and then let people know what's happening, and possibly even, if it's appropriate, you know, why that decision was made, or what the intended outcome was, so that if there is an unintended outcome, then at least people understand, well, that wasn't the aim, and people have thought this through, so it becomes less of an issue then, I think.
Definitely.
So should we delve into those kind of the different sort of teams in there?
So I think on paper, if you've got a balanced team, let's say, for a better word, that soda loop process, is it easier than, you know, if you've got a team of, if we go back, you know, comment on insights, and you've got 2 blue characters and 2 green, how does that work? Because surely going through that soda loop is going to be a lot longer. You may never make a decision, or you may just make a really rash, quick decision. So yeah, like, how do you then make sure that you can effectively go through the process?
Yeah, and I think actually, and that's the answer is this, because those sorts of people that you might think, you know, they're very high consideration. So I think that when I didn't come up with these sections, I sort of cherry picked them from places, and I just saw it and I found that it worked, and then just refined it. But you can see from the loop that different people, the different colours, or those different, you know, are naturally like that picking, right, here's where we need to be. That's a very high red. That's a very classic red. Look, I can see where we are, but none of that really matters to me. Where we need to be, that's all that I care about. The things to avoid is very high green and very high blue. Possibilities, very high yellow. Making a decision is very high red. And then you're on to the action, which would be sort of separate from this. But also, if you give that high green blue team a process to follow, they're very typically, we're talking, let's just say that your preference matches your ability in this conversation for the sake of it, which isn't necessarily true, but let's just say for the sake of this argument, if you're high blue, you're highly skilled in compliance. If you're high red, you're highly decisive and you make good decisions. So let's just say that for the sake of argument. But that high blue green team, therefore, is very good at following a process.
Yeah.
So they're very good at refining over time and saying, right, here we weren't particularly good, we only came up with 2 options, so that, you know, next time we need to do more. They're very good at, now if you don't have this process, they'll follow their natural tendencies and potentially not think of those options,
miss that step,
and delay that. But when they have a process,
so the process is almost then leading them to that's it, where you haven't got that red in place that's going to make that decision. The process almost then protects them.
100%, and the other way around as well. So if we look at the other team, high yellow 2 and high red 2, and they're strong in those things as well. They're forced to, hang on a second, let's stop. Let's not just make a decision or talk all day about it. Let's start with what we need to avoid. And actually, let's stop because again, you know, Ben, I'm not like, you know, throwing any shade in your direction, but a very common thing for that high yellow is they never they don't even start to think about, here's this thing, what are the possibilities? There isn't even that moment of, so where do we want to be? It's just, this has sparked me, and this is a very natural thing to me. Hear something, see something, and just go, this would be amazing for the place that I'm responsible for. But it's about going back to, is that in line with the vision? Is that in line with the needs? Is it in line with the priorities? So this process there, that's the whole point, that it supports that framework. And then I also want to kind of say, I've had a lot of these kind of positions, and I wouldn't say that I naturally, in a team situation, I might say, right, come on, let's move on to this, let's move on to the D in the soda loop. I might do that. In my own practice, I had a situation recently where there was a very complicated situation in the sort of the community that I worked in the actual area, not in the school. And that loop was going constantly, and I sort of made a decision on what I was going to do. Then more information came in, so I had to go back to, right, now I need to avoid this, and now my options are this. I wasn't formally going back through, but I was naturally, I have those sorts of processes, I think, sort of more hardwired, and I'm constantly sort of going back to them. But the process itself, and especially sort of, I suppose, the key leaders in that room saying, we need to make a decision here, or we need to stop here, we haven't considered what we need to avoid, let's go back, and just having that as part of, I've worked with leaders that add things to their SLT agenda to mitigate for that kind of high energy that they don't have. So one that didn't have a lot of high red energy, actually always put in the agenda, what result do we want from this?
Structure it, so you make sure that you achieve the end goal, which naturally may become very hard for that group of people.
Whereas if they had that other person, they'd be like, guys, but what do we actually want the result to be from? Because they don't have that voice at the table. They have it on the agenda itself. I
had that, funny enough, that very similar experience, and it was what will success look like by the end of this meeting? And I was like, I found that to be really useful to me. because it provided that clarity and it meant I would plan it well. And again, I think that's why you were saying, Jazz, about having the balanced team, where those preferences lie. I think this is where the process can either sort of accelerate, if you like, or really clarify what a team is like. But if you have got gaps, no problem, because you've got the process that will ensure that even if you haven't got something naturally coming by someone's preference, it will be there because you've got a process to follow. And then the other element of it, which I said earlier on, is the theme of this series being about pressure in action, is that then alleviates the feeling of pressure. So the situation's the same, isn't it?
Yeah.
But if I feel different about it, in that the pressure is only providing positive things, positive responses, so that I feel sharp and I'm up for this, then that's great. And the reason for that is I've got a process. So and so's not here today to do that. It doesn't matter. We can make up for it because we've got some questions to ask ourselves, and then you can even do it by yourself. Then, can't you? Yeah. Ultimately, if you sort of have to make a decision, there's only you, there's no one else to speak to. You can at least refer to this to help you go through that, which is why I think it's powerful and it's empowering, rather than it being a restrictive process that is burdensome. I think it's the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Perfect.